Hey, friends, welcome back to Hot Air with me, Joshua Robert, the podcast where we talk about the stuff that nobody tells you, especially the things that religion gets really weird about. And I mean, that's just a recent development. December only, okay? After December, we're moving on from Jesus. Today, we're going to flip the script a little bit, though. After a few heavy episodes about Bible mistranslations, conversion therapies, and all the ways that the church has been pretty fucking shady towards queer people, I thought it was time for something a little bit more fun, a little less dark. So, we are still going to talk about Jesus today. Yes, Jesus, you know, the man, the myth, the legend, but not boring, judgmental versions that you've heard about. I mean, the actual guy who hung out with outcasts, flipped tables like a real housewife, made religious leaders uncomfortable, and basically loved people exactly as they were. But before we do that, make sure you're following me on Instagram and TikTok at _hotairpod and submit your listener stories and topic suggestions on my website, Hot Air with Joshua Robert. And while you're there, you can shop my merch. There's plenty of it to go around. And also, recent development, head to my Instagram to play What is Josh Drinking Today? It's a game that was an absolute hit last week. I had a lot of fun with it. I'm always drinking something out of my Hot Air mug. And so I was like, let's just make a funny little game about it. So I'm going to take a sip. You try to figure out what's in here. Again, I'm going to give you a clue. It's pretty much straight up alcohol. It's Sunday, okay? It's the day of the Lord, and I have a heavy pour in there. Bringing it back to the theme today. In short, Jesus might have been the ultimate queer ally, and I am here to explain why. So, maybe grab yourself a very strong beverage, get in something comfy, and let's do some biblical truth telling with a side of sass. So make sure you bring your sense of humor with you today, okay? Let's hit it. Part 1. Setting the record straight, ironically. As I like to say in these episodes about religion, before anyone clutches their pearls or lights a candle or starts typing an angry comment that begins with, as a Christian, just relax, okay? Take a pause. Jesus and I are good. We're vibing. We've talked it out. He gets me. I get him. It's all fine. And honestly, I think he'd be absolutely exhausted by how people use his name today. Now, I did not grow up in a church, but a lot of people did grow up in the church, and you were probably taught that Jesus is watching you at all times, just like fucking Santa. He's disappointed, he's shaking his head, he's tallying your sins like a weird celestial accountant, especially if you were queer. Extra points deducted if you were having fun. But here's the thing that no one tells you until you're older and absolutely emotionally fried. The Jesus that people preach today is often nothing like the Jesus in the Bible. Somewhere along the way, Jesus got a complete rebrand. Perhaps that was in 1946 when they added the word homosexual to the Bible. That could have been the rebrand. He went from radical love revolutionary to suburban HOA president with a strict dress code and opinions about who can use which bathroom. And that really feels incorrect. To put it simply, it's incorrect. So today, I want to make a case, a fun one, a slightly spicy one, a historically grounded one that Jesus, the actual Jesus, was way more aligned with queer people than with the institutions currently using his name to harm them. Not because he waved a pride flag, not because he said love is love, babies, but because everything he stood for directly opposes the systems that oppress queer people today. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So first of all, let's talk about who Jesus actually spent time with, because this is important. Jesus did not hang out with religious elites, rule enforcers, moral police, people obsessed with purity, folks who loved pointing fingers. Those people actually hated him. They were not his vibe. They were not on his level. They no likey. Jesus hung out with sex workers, with poor people, sick people, social outcasts, the quote unquote unclean, and people that everyone else avoided, which I don't know if you've noticed, but that list feels very familiar. That's basically the LGBTQ plus guest list for brunch. And no, I'm not saying that all LGBTQ plus people are sex workers or sick people or social outcasts, but I will say that there are certain groups of people that do point fingers at us and say that we are unclean, that we are outcasts, that we are all the things that technically Jesus was besties with. Jesus consistently centered the marginalized, and not in a performative thoughts and prayers kind of way like everyone does now. It was in a let me dismantle the entire social hierarchy that keeps you oppressed kind of way, a much more meaningful kind of way. He healed people without asking if they deserved it. He fed people without checking their moral resume. He defended people that everyone else wanted to punish. And most importantly, he constantly pissed off religious leaders, which should be your first clue that if modern religious leaders love what you're doing, you might not actually be following Jesus. Because Jesus's biggest enemies were not sinners, they were hypocrites. Yeah, I said it. Hypocrites, okay? The people who weaponized scripture, the people who enforced rules without compassion, the people who cared more about appearances than humanity. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. Jesus didn't come to protect tradition. He came to challenge it. He didn't come to enforce purity culture. He came to expose how damaging it was. And he did not come to gatekeep God. He came to tell people that God wasn't owned by institutions, which is incredibly queer-coded, if I'm being quite honest. Part 2. Jesus versus the church. A tale as old as time. Here is where things get interesting. If Jesus walked into many modern churches today, mega churches included, I genuinely believe he would be escorted out by security. He'd be too disruptive, too uncomfortable, too inclusive, too unwilling to stay in his lane. Because Jesus had a habit of doing things that were considered inappropriate, scandalous, and socially unacceptable. He spoke to women publicly. He touched people deemed unclean. He defended a woman about to be stoned and told the crowd to check their own sins first. He flipped tables in the temple because religious leaders were exploiting people financially. Let me repeat that one, okay? If you've watched Real Housewives, you can get on board with this. Jesus flipped tables over religious corruption. And speaking of flipping tables, one time I got really mad at my friend and I was like, I am getting up and leaving this room right now because if I don't, I'm going to pull a Real Housewife and I'm going to flip this fucking kitchen table over in a second. That was before I started therapy many years ago. Sorry, Natalie. But I do still have a dream of flipping a table one day. I just think it would be absolutely hilarious. And now that I know Jesus did it, I'm leaning a little bit more towards making it happen soon. Okay, but again, Jesus flipped tables over religious corruption, not because people were loving the wrong gender, not because someone was living sinfully, but because religion was being used to control and exploit. And yet somehow today, the loudest voices in Christianity are obsessed with controlling bodies, identities, and love, especially queer ones, and I suppose the bodies of women. Biological women who can get pregnant. You know where I'm going with that. I don't want to eat my own words, so I'm just going to leave that there. And if Jesus were alive today, do you really think he'd be standing outside a pride parade with a megaphone, yelling about hell, carrying signs that have flames painted on them, saying that we are all gonna fucking burn? Or do you think that he'd be outside, or do you think he'd be like inside, eating street food, talking to people who've been rejected by their families and reminding them that they are loved, and probably dancing up a storm as a fucking go-go dancer or something? Because historically speaking, that's his brand. Jesus consistently chose relationship over rules and compassion over condemnation, context over control. And that, my friends, is why the religious leaders of his time wanted him gone. Not because he was too loving, but because he threatened their power. Queer people threaten power in the exact same way. We challenge those rigid gender roles. We challenge traditional family structures. We challenge the idea that there's only one right way to love. We challenge authority just by existing, honestly. And that's why queerness has always made institutions uncomfortable, religious ones included. Not because it's immoral, but because it's uncontrollable. And Jesus loved uncontrollable love. Let's also talk about the concept of chosen family because this one is huge. Jesus repeatedly redefined what family was. When someone told him his mother and brothers were looking for him, he literally said something along the lines of, "Who is my family? Those who do the will of God," which is biblical speak for blood isn't everything. Chosen family, something that queer people are famous for, is not some modern invention. It's really deeply biblical. Jesus prioritized community, connection, and shared values over biology. So when people say queer families are not biblical, I kind of like want to laugh or cry or flip a table. It depends on the day, really. But Jesus didn't obsess over gender roles. He didn't enforce masculinity or femininity. He didn't tell people to stay in boxes. In fact, he actually broke social norms around who was allowed to access God. And maybe that's why queer people resonate with him so deeply, even after everything religion has put us through. Because at the core of it, Jesus was not about shame. He wasn't about fear. He was not about exclusion. He was about liberation. And that is a message that queer people understand at the core. Part 3, Jesus, sexuality, and the loudest silence in the room. So let's address the thing people get very quiet about when this conversation starts to make sense. Jesus never talked about homosexuality at all. Not once. Not even a vague metaphor, not a parable, not a side comment, not a by the way, nothing, which is honestly pretty impressive considering how much time modern Christians spend talking about it on his behalf. Now, I was not alive back then, so I don't actually know if there were gays running around the town or lesbians or what any of that looked like, but Jesus never said shit about it. And before someone says, well, that doesn't mean he approved of it, like, okay, sure, but why don't we follow that logic for a second? Jesus talked a lot about the things that he disapproved of. He talked about greed constantly. He talked about hypocrisy constantly. He talked about judgment constantly. He talked about power, ego, money, violence, exploitation, pride, cruelty, and religious abuse constantly. I'm out of breath. I know people are going to really hold on to that pride one, but so if same-sex love was the moral emergency of the century, if it was truly the thing that would unravel society, send people to hell, and destroy God's plan, you'd think it would have been first on the list, if not made the list at all. But it didn't, which tells us something very important. Either Jesus didn't think it was an issue, or it wasn't even on the radar in the way modern Christianity pretends that it is. I can tell. I'm getting heated. It's called passion, okay? It's just passion. Okay, honestly though, both of those options are great news for the queer people because what Jesus did care about was how people treated each other, who had power, who was being excluded, who was being harmed by rigid systems disguised as holiness. Jesus was always less interested in who you were sleeping with and far more interested in whether you were loving your neighbor. And that's a problem for people whose entire theology depends on policing other people's bodies. Now let's talk about one of my favorite under-discussed verses in the Bible, the one that makes theologians shift uncomfortably in their chairs and suddenly pretend the Old Testament is the only thing that exists. I was going to say drum roll, but this deserves like a dun dun dun. Matthew 19. Jesus is talking about marriage, and someone brings up divorce. And in the middle of this conversation, Jesus casually drops a line about eunuchs. And not in a dismissive way, not in a gross way, not in a these people are weird kind of way. He says there are eunuchs who were born that way, eunuchs who were made that way by others, and eunuchs who chose that life for spiritual reasons. Now, let's pause, because eunuchs were people who did not fit neatly into traditional gender or sexual roles. Some were castrated, yes, but many were simply people who didn't conform to expected norms of masculinity, reproduction, or sexuality. They existed outside of the binary structure of man marries woman and produces heirs. And Jesus doesn't condemn them. He acknowledges them, he includes them, he normalizes them as part of human diversity. In the ancient world, that is radical. That's Jesus in first century language saying there are people who don't fit the standard model and that is okay, which feels extremely relevant. If Jesus were the rigid moral enforcer people paint him as, this was the perfect moment to shut that down, to say that anything outside of heterosexual marriage is wrong. He could have drew the line to just exclude them, but he didn't. Instead, he expanded the conversation. Jesus had a habit of doing that, okay? Widening the circle when everyone else wanted it to shrink. And that's why the argument that Jesus would never support queer people feels so weak. Because everything we know about how he interacted with difference completely suggests the opposite. He didn't fear people who live differently. He didn't shame people for not fitting in. He didn't force conformity. He really just met people where they were and then challenged the systems that hurt them. And that is ally behavior. That's what this whole episode is about. Jesus is a fucking ally. Now, would Jesus understand modern labels like gay or bi or trans or non-binary? Probably not. Let's be real. He didn't even have a concept of email, okay? But would he understand exclusion and shame, being cast out by religious authorities, being misunderstood and misrepresented by people claiming to speak for God? Abso-fucking-lutely. That is how he lived. He fucking lived that. Which is why queer people reading the Gospels often feel this weird sense of recognition. Kind of like, oh, you too. It just lands. Part 4. Why queer people make religion nervous and why Jesus didn't. Here's the thing institutions hate more than sin. It's unpredictability. And queerness is very unpredictable. It refuses neat boxes, it disrupts tradition, it challenges assumptions, it asks better questions, and it exposes how fragile certain systems really are. And religion, especially organized religion, loves structure. Structure. Rules, hierarchies, clear roles, man, woman, husband, wife, leader, follower, obedience, and then reward. Queer existence messes with all of that just by existing and being honest. And Jesus was not a structure first kind of guy. He constantly subverted expectations. He broke Sabbath rules to heal people. He talked to people he was not supposed to. He prioritized human need over religious law. When confronted with rigid doctrine, his response was almost always some version of, is that actually loving? That's it. That was a test. Not, is this traditional? Not, is this comfortable? Not, does this preserve power? Just, does this bring life, dignity, and care to people? That's all he asked. And if the answer was no, he didn't care how long the rule had existed. He broke it, which brings me to something that might sting a little for some listeners, but stay with me. Modern Christianity often looks more like the Pharisees than like Jesus. The obsession with purity, the public shaming, the selective morality, the moral superiority, the fixation on other people's sins. Those were literally the behaviors Jesus condemned the most. He didn't say the Pharisees were wrong because they believed in God. He said they were wrong because they used God as a weapon. And if you don't really know what Pharisees are, well, guess what? Me neither. So perhaps I'll explore that more. There's a lot in religion that I don't completely grasp. But in short, Pharisees were a prominent Jewish sect during Jesus' time, known for strict observance of Jewish law, that had really strict traditional laws and rules and belief in religion, I guess. That's how I'm going to kind of wrap it up. And as I was saying, they used God as a weapon. And that's exactly what has happened with LGBTQ plus people. Queer bodies became battlegrounds for religious control. Our identities became symbols. Our lives became issues to some people. Our existence became something to debate instead of something to protect. And Jesus never treated people like issues. He treated them like people, which is why I genuinely believe that if Jesus were around today, queer people wouldn't have to convince him of their humanity. He would already see it. The convincing would be for the church. And I'm pretty sure Jesus would have our back. Part 5. Love the sinner, hate the sin, aka the phrase that Jesus never said. So we need to talk about this phrase. You know the one, the sentence that gets dropped into conversation like it's supposed to be comforting, but somehow always lands like a slap. Love the sinner, hate the sin. First of all, Jesus never said that. Ever. Again, not once. There's a lot of things he's never said. Not even in a lost manuscript. I suppose it could be lost, so we'd never know. Not even in footnotes. That phrase does not appear anywhere in the Bible. It's not a quote. It's not a teaching. It's not even a remix, okay? It is a slogan. And like most slogans, it was created to sound nice while doing something quietly cruel. Because let's be honest, when someone says, love the sinner, hate the sin to a queer person, what they're really saying is, I will tolerate you as long as you don't fully exist. They're saying, I'll love you, but not the part of you that loves, which is, again, not love. That's conditional approval with a little smile. Jesus' version of love was never conditional like that. Jesus did not say, I'll heal you, but only if you promise to change later. He did not say, you're forgiven, but I still think you're gross. He didn't say, God loves you, but let's talk about how wrong you are first. He just loved people, end of story, full stop, put a period on it. And then, if there was growth to be had, it came from relationship, not rejection. Modern Christianity flipped that model completely. Now it is change first, then you are welcome, which is fascinating because that's literally the opposite of how Jesus operated. And I'm not saying that it kind of like, as these words are coming out of my mouth, it's kind of like, am I saying the church will welcome you and then they'll prevent you from being gay later? No, because I don't believe that being gay, obviously, is a sin. So I think some of that might have come across that way. That is not what I'm trying to say here. I guess what I'm saying is if you have to shrink yourself in order to be loved, that is not divine love. That's emotional extortion. And queer people know this instinctively. That's why so many of us have walked away from church, not because we hated God, but because we couldn't survive the constant negotiation of our humanity. And that is also probably why a lot of us queer people, LGBTQ plus rainbow, all the things, have never even stepped inside a church or have and never went back because we feel the judgment when really we should be welcomed with open fucking arms. But now let's get into the fun part, okay? Queer joy. Because if you really want to freak out religious extremists, don't argue theology, be happy. There is something deeply threatening to systems of control about queer people living openly, laughing loudly, loving freely, building families, creating art, dancing, and thriving because joy exposes lies. If queerness were truly sinful and destructive, or if it was unnatural, it wouldn't produce so much creativity, resilience, humor, and connection. It wouldn't create these chosen families. It would not birth entire cultures. It wouldn't survive centuries of oppression. And I'd just like to know that a lot of the people who are very anti-gay benefit from our creativity and the cultures that we have created and the art we have created. They unknowingly absorb it all of the time. I'm sorry if there's anybody listening that really just loves God and hates the gays. The only reason your life is fun is because of us. Let's be real. On every TV show, there's a gay writer somewhere that has written a joke that you laughed your ass off at. there's a gay photographer or fashion designer, and you probably own something they designed or looked at a photo or a painting by a gay artist and was like, oh, that's beautiful, without knowing that you were loving a gay human's creativity. And I kind of love that. That's the evil side of me where I'm like, you secretly love us and you don't even know it. So queer joy is not a rebellion against God. It's evidence of life. And Jesus was obsessed with life and obsessed with love. And that is what we embody. He said that he came so people could have life and have it abundantly, not cautiously, not quietly, not apologetically, abundantly, which is such a gay word, honestly. Abundant. Life doesn't look like shame. Abundant life doesn't look like shame. It doesn't look like hiding. It doesn't look like celibacy forced on you by fear. It doesn't look like erasing yourself to keep others comfortable. Abundant life looks like authenticity and connection, celebration, community, love that multiplies instead of shrinks. That is why I think that queer joy is actually spiritual, not because it's perfect, not because it's moral, but because it is honest. And honesty was always Jesus's thing. He had zero patience for people pretending to be holy while causing harm. He called them out publicly. He embarrassed them. He used parables that were basically ancient subtweets, okay? He came for them. He left the comments. He was a troll, but a good troll on the internet. So when people today try to use Jesus' name to justify homophobia or transphobia or exclusion, I don't think that he would be flattered. I think, again, he'd be flipping tables. He's at it again. Jesus is always flipping tables in modern day. Which brings me to part 6, if Jesus were here today. Let's be real and let's play a game. Purely hypothetical, just for fun, for science, okay? If Jesus showed up today, like actually showed up, where do you think he'd be? Do you think he'd be on a cable news panel yelling about culture wars, endorsing politicians, policing bathrooms, debating people's identity on Twitter with Elon Musk? Or do you think that he'd be sitting with people who were kicked out of their homes, eating with people that society calls undesirable, listening more than talking, challenging religious leaders who profit off of fear? And that profit, Jesus would not be happy about that profit either, honey, because historically, it's always been the second one. Jesus would not be obsessed with being right. He'd be obsessed with being present. And here's the part that always gets me. Jesus himself was misunderstood, misrepresented, and condemned by religious authorities who then later adopted him. Like, make it make sense. He was accused of leading people astray. He was accused of breaking tradition. He was accused of blasphemy. He was punished not for hate, but for love that disrupted power. So when queer people are accused of destroying morality or confusing society or leading others astray, hello, gay agenda, there's an uncomfortable parallel here. Now, I'm not saying that we are Jesus, relax, okay? They should be so lucky, but there's a pattern. The pattern is familiar. Marginalized people living truthfully always scare institutions built on control. And Jesus was never on the side of control. He was on the side of liberation. Part 7, reclaiming Jesus without the trauma. I want to end this episode with something a little bit more gentle. You don't owe Christianity anything. You don't owe the church forgiveness. You don't owe theology your attention. You don't owe anyone belief. If religion hurt you, you are allowed to walk away. But if a part of you still feels drawn to spirituality, to Jesus, to something bigger, that doesn't make you weak or confused. It makes you 100% human. You're allowed to reclaim what was taken from you in whatever way you want. You're allowed to leave behind what harmed you. You're allowed to believe in a God who actually likes you. And that version of God can be completely made up by you. It doesn't have to be something that was written on paper a gazillion years ago. And if Jesus is real, if his message is what the Gospels say it is, then queerness was never a problem for him. The problem was always fear, power, control, and ego, and those things still exist today. They're just wearing a little bit nicer clothes. So if you take anything from this episode, let it be this. You are not loved in spite of who you are. You are loved as who you are. And if a version of Jesus tells you otherwise, that version was rewritten. And there you have it. We made it. This episode was a little bit shorter today. To be 100% transparent with you, I wanted to do an episode that wasn't so negative about religion and conversion therapy and all of these things that kind of isolate the queer community, but it's almost more difficult to find positive stories relating to religion and Jesus and the Bible and where we were at in current day. So if there's more positive ones, they probably will not be that full 45-minute to an hour long episode, unfortunately. So the takeaway from today is that Jesus was probably more chill and loving and inclusive than anyone gave him credit for, especially when it came to queer people. If you felt judged by religion growing up, maybe it wasn't you. Maybe the story was just written again in 1946 by a bunch of straight men. And that's okay. You can reclaim your spirituality, your joy, your love, all without permission. So thank you for listening to Hot Air with me, Joshua Robert. And if this episode made you laugh, made you think, or roll your eyes in recognition, share it with a friend who could use a reminder that love is much bigger than the rules. So until next time, stay loud, stay proud, stay fabulous, and don't let anyone tell you who you are allowed to be. And with that, I will see you next Tuesday.